March 15, 1944. 22,000 feet above Germany. Inside the cramped cockpit of his Messerschmitt Bf 110 Night feet, Oberleutnant Klaus Richter stared at his radar screen and felt his hands begin to shake. His radar operator Hans Meyer sat behind him in the darkness, watching the same impossible image. Hans's voice cracked when he spoke over the intercom, struggling to be heard above the roar of twin engines. The screen showed something that couldn't be real. Not 50 targets, not 100. A solid wall of metal stretching across the night sky like a moving mountain range. Dozens of aircraft, hundreds, maybe all flying so close together that German radar couldn't tell where one plane ended and another began. Klaus grabbed his radio handset. His throat felt tight. His voice, when it came out, sounded like a stranger's. Massive formation coming in. Flying low, flying fast. He paused. The words stuck in his mouth like broken glass. Then he said the thing that every German pilot had learned to fear. They are not Americans. These are the Canadians. For a moment, the radio went silent. Then his ground commander's voice came back quieter than before, almost resigned. God help you, Klaus. Klaus had been flying night missions for 2 years. He had shot down 11 Allied bombers. 8 were British Lancasters picked off one by one as they scattered across the German countryside. 2 were American B-24 Liberators that got lost and wandered into his hunting grounds. 1 was a Canadian Lancaster. He remembered that night in January. Cold and clear. The Lancaster had been damaged flying alone, separated from its formation. Even wounded, even trailing smoke from a dead engine, it had taken him 3 attack runs to bring it down. The rear gunner kept firing until the moment the plane hit the frozen earth and exploded. Klaus still had nightmares about that rear gunner. About the tracer rounds that came so close, he could feel their heat through his canopy. About the determination of men who refused to quit even when death was certain. Now on this March night, what Klaus saw on his radar wasn't a few damaged stragglers. This was a bomber stream, a new tactic the Canadians had perfected. They flew so close together that the formation looked like a single massive creature crawling through the darkness. They came in waves that lasted 45 minutes or more. By the time a German fighter shot down one Lancaster and turned around to find another target, the sky was already full of falling bombs and rising fires. The smoke made it impossible to see. The fires blinded German searchlights. The chaos itself became a weapon that protected the bombers. Klaus pulled back on his control stick and began to climb toward that impossible wall of metal. He thought about his mother in Berlin, about the letter he had written her yesterday but hadn't mailed yet, about how she would cry when the telegram came. But mostly he thought about September 6 months ago, about an American B-17 pilot who crashed at a Canadian base and learned something that would change how he saw the war. About the moment when American pride met Canadian excellence and had to decide which mattered more, being right or staying alive. This is the story of that moment. This is the story of the bombers that America feared to admit were better than ours. And this is the story of the American pilot who learned why. 6 months earlier, September 1943, East Anglia, England. The morning briefing room at an American 8th Air Force base smelled like coffee and cigarettes and nervous sweat. Captain James Hartwell, 24 years old, stood at the back of the room with his arms crossed and a cocky smile on his face. Jimmy, as everyone called him, had flown 12 combat missions. 12 times he had climbed into his B-17 Flying Fortress, lifted off from English soil, and flown deep into German territory in broad daylight. 12 times he had come home alive. That made him an old hand by Army Air Corps standards. That made him confident, maybe too confident. The intelligence officer at the front of the room pointed to a map of Germany with his wooden pointer. The target for today was Schweinfurt, ball-bearing factories, critical to German war production. Expected losses, the officer said in a voice that tried to sound reassuring, 5 to 8%. Jimmy turned to his co-pilot and grinned. I'll take those odds. His co-pilot, a kid from Ohio named Danny Chen, didn't smile back. Danny had been at the briefing for Regensburg 2 weeks ago when they said the same thing about losses. 15 B-17s hadn't come home that day. 15 crews, 10 men each. 150 empty chairs in the mess hall that night. But Jimmy wasn't thinking about Regensburg. Jimmy was thinking about the speech he'd given his crew yesterday, the one about American air power and American courage, and how they were going to win this war by looking the enemy straight in the eye. He believed every word of it. The B-17 Flying Fortress, he'd told them, was the most advanced bomber in the world. 1350 caliber machine guns, 4 Wright Cyclone engines, the ability to fly at 25,000 feet where German fighters struggled to climb, and they flew in formation in those tight defensive boxes that German pilots called the Steel Gauntlet. We don't hide in the darkness like the British, Jimmy had said. We don't scatter and run like frightened rabbits. We fly in daylight in formation with precision. We hit what we aim at. That's the American way. Now, standing in that briefing room with 230 B-17s preparing to launch, Jimmy felt invincible. He felt like nothing could touch him. He felt like God himself rode in the co-pilot seat of American bombers and guided them home. By nightfall, 60 of those 230 B-17s would be burning wreckage scattered across Germany and France. By nightfall, 600 American airmen would be dead or captured or dying in the wreckage of their fortresses. By nightfall, Jimmy Hartwell would learn that confidence without wisdom is just arrogance wearing a uniform. But he didn't know that yet. Not at 0830 hours on a clear September morning when the sun was shining and the engines were warming up and everything felt possible. The bombers took off one by one, forming up into their defensive boxes as they climbed. From the ground, they looked magnificent. Silver birds catching the sunlight, flying in perfect formation, their contrails drawing white lines across the blue sky. You could see them from 50 miles away. Every farmer in England could look up and count them and feel proud. Every German fighter pilot in Bavaria could see them too. Jimmy's B-17, which he'd named Liberty Bell after his girlfriend back in Texas, took her position in the formation. They climbed to 25,000 feet. At that altitude, your breath freezes in your oxygen mask. The temperature outside drops to 40 degrees below zero. You can see for 100 miles in every direction. Everything looks clear and beautiful and safe. Until the Messerschmitts came. They appeared like wolves out of the sun. German Bf-109 fighters, fast and deadly, diving down from 30,000 feet with their cannons blazing. The sky erupted in tracer fire and smoke, and the sharp crack of exploding shells against aluminum skin. Jimmy's waist gunner started screaming into the intercom. Fighters 6 o'clock high, fighters at 3 o'clock level, they're everywhere. The noise was incredible. The rattling roar of 13 50 caliber machine guns firing at once. The deeper boom of German cannons. The whistle of shells passing close enough to feel. And underneath it all, the steady drone of 4 Wright Cyclone engines working hard, straining to keep that 70,000-pound bomber in the sky. Jimmy fought the controls as German fighters made pass after pass. He watched other B-17s in his formation take hits. Saw one explode in a ball of fire, saw another fall away, spinning, trailing smoke crew members tumbling out like rag dolls as they bailed out at 25,000 feet. Then Liberty Bell shuddered. A loud bang, metal tearing. Jimmy's instrument panel lit up with warning lights. Number 3 engines hit. Danny Chen shouted. Fire, fire in number 3. Jimmy reached for the engine cutoff switches. His hands were steady even though his heart was racing. He'd trained for this. He could handle this. He hit the fire suppression button. Nothing happened. The fire kept spreading. Another impact. Shells tearing through the thin aluminum skin of the bomber. Another scream from the back. This one different. This one the sound of a man dying. Jimmy's waist gunner Tommy Garcia from El Paso, Texas, had been standing at his gun position when the German cannon shells came through. One moment he was firing at a passing Messerschmitt. The next moment he was on the floor bleeding, not moving. Tommy Garcia was 22 years old. He had a wife and a baby daughter back in Texas. 2 weeks earlier, he'd shown Jimmy a letter from his wife saying the baby had taken her first steps. Tommy had grinned like a kid on Christmas morning, said he couldn't wait to see her. Now Tommy Garcia's blood sprayed across the inside of Liberty Bell's fuselage. The smell hit Jimmy even through his oxygen mask. Blood and smoke and hot metal and burned coffee because Tommy had been drinking coffee right before the attack started. That smell would stay with Jimmy for the rest of his life. 70 years later, the smell of coffee would sometimes make him remember, and he'd have to step outside until the memory passed. We can't make it home, Danny Chen said. His voice was steady, but his hands shook on the controls. We're losing altitude. Number 3's still on fire and number 2's running rough. We need to land, now. Jimmy scanned the horizon through the smoke. Somewhere below them was England, or France, hard to tell. Everything looked the same from 20,000 feet when you're falling and burning. There, a runway, didn't matter whose, didn't matter where, just a straight line of concrete in a green field. I'm taking her down, Jimmy said. The landing was more like a controlled crash. Landing gear damaged. Hydraulics failing. Liberty Bell hit that runway at 140 miles per hour with her belly scraping concrete and her tail section half torn off. Sparks flew, metal screamed. They skidded 2,000 feet before finally sliding to a stop at an angle that blocked the entire runway. Jimmy sat in the pilot's seat, hands still gripping the controls, breathing hard. His whole body shook. Danny Chen was crying. The rest of the crew was trying to get Tommy Garcia's body out of the waist gun position. Then someone was pulling open the side hatch. British voices. No, not British, Canadian, accents slightly different. They were shouting something about clearing the runway, about having 82 Lancasters launching in 3 hours, about bloody Yanks always making a mess. Jimmy climbed out of Liberty Bell on legs that barely worked. He fell off the wing and landed hard on the concrete. Lay there looking up at the sky. Clear blue. Peaceful. Like nothing had happened. A Canadian ground crew chief stood over him. The man's face was weathered and hard, the face of someone who'd seen too much death to be impressed by one more dramatic landing. "You all right?" Captain Jimmy nodded. Couldn't speak yet. The crew chief looked at Liberty Bell, at the torn metal, at the blood dripping from the waist gun position, at Tommy Garcia's body being carried out by the surviving crew members. "Rough day," the crew chief said. It wasn't a question. How many, Jimmy finally managed to ask. How many didn't make it back? "From your raid," the crew chief shrugged. "Reports are still coming in. Last I heard, 60 planes lost. Maybe more." 60 out of 230. That wasn't 5 to 8%. That was 26%. More than 1 in 4. Those weren't acceptable losses. Those were catastrophic losses. "We lost 1 last night," the crew chief said. "Out of 82. Jimmy looked up at him. Didn't understand at first. "Your boys lost 60 out of 230 in daylight. We lost 1 out of 82 in darkness." "You do the math, Captain." He walked away, already directing his crew to push Liberty Bell off the runway before the Lancaster bombers started their engines. Jimmy sat on the concrete and tried to do the math. Tried to understand how flying in darkness, in conditions every American commander said were impossible, could be safer than flying in daylight with perfect visibility. It didn't make sense. It contradicted everything he had been taught. But the numbers didn't lie. His squadron had lost 60 planes. The Canadians had lost 1. Something was very wrong with what Jimmy thought he knew about winning this war. A medical orderly helped him to his feet and led him to a tent where a doctor checked him over. Broken ribs from the landing impact. Burns on his hands from fighting the fire in No. 3 engine. Cuts and bruises. Nothing serious compared to Tommy Garcia, who was dead, or the ball turret gunner who'd lost part of his foot. The doctor declared Jimmy grounded for 6 weeks minimum. Sent him to a barracks to rest. Said someone would notify his squadron command about the crash. So Jimmy Hartwell found himself stuck at a Canadian bomber base. RAF Linton on Ouse, somewhere in Yorkshire. A place he'd never heard of, flying with men he'd never met, watching an operation he didn't understand. That first night, unable to sleep because his ribs hurt and his hands hurt and his soul hurt from watching Tommy Garcia die, Jimmy walked outside the barracks. It was 22 hard hours, full darkness, cold wind blowing across the airfield, and then he heard them, the engines. 4 Packard Merlin engines per aircraft, 82 aircraft, 328 engines, all starting up at the same time. The sound was physical. It hit you in the chest, made your bones vibrate, like standing next to a waterfall or a freight train or the voice of God announcing Judgment Day. Jimmy walked toward the flight line, watched the Lancasters taxi to the runway. They were painted flat black, no shiny aluminum like American bombers, just matte black that swallowed light. They looked like pieces of darkness breaking away from the night itself. 1 every 45 seconds. That was the timing. 1 Lancaster rolling down the runway, lifting into the air, disappearing into clouds. Then the next. Then the next. 82 bombers, all taking off into weather that would have grounded American operations. 10 tenths cloud cover. Rain. 30-mile-per-hour crosswinds. Jimmy stood there for 2 hours watching them go. Nobody stopped him. Nobody questioned why an American captain was watching Canadian operations. Maybe they figured he'd earned the right to watch, having just lost 60 friends. When the last Lancaster disappeared into the storm, Jimmy walked back to his barracks. Tried to sleep. Couldn't. Kept thinking about those black bombers flying in formation through clouds so thick you couldn't see your own wingtip. Kept wondering how they didn't collide. Kept trying to understand how anyone could navigate in complete darkness with no visual references. At 06:00 hours, he gave up on sleep and went back outside. Dawn breaking, gray and cold. He walked to the control tower, found a Canadian liaison officer who didn't mind having an American observer. "They're coming back," the officer said. "How many?" Jimmy asked. The officer checked his board. 81 confirmed on approach. One reported mechanical failure ditched in the North Sea crew recovered by Air Sea Rescue. 82 launched, 81 returning, 1% loss rate. Jimmy did the math again. His squadron 26%, the Canadians 1%. 26 times safer to fly at night in a storm than to fly in daylight with perfect visibility. The Lancasters landed one by one, some with engines smoking, some with visible battle damage holes torn in their wings and fuselages. But they landed. Crews climbed out, lit cigarettes, walked to debriefing. No celebration, no cheering, just another night's work. Jimmy watched them and felt something crack inside his certainty, felt his American pride, which had been absolute, begin to develop fissures. These men weren't supposed to be better than American pilots. They were colonials, farmers from Saskatchewan and Manitoba, boys who'd never seen a city bigger than Winnipeg before the war. The British brass called them cowboys and gave them the impossible missions because everyone expected them to fail. But they weren't failing. They were succeeding at a rate that made American operations look amateurish by comparison. A tall man in a wing commander's uniform appeared beside Jimmy, didn't introduce himself, just stood there watching the last Lancaster taxi in. The man's hair was black going gray. His face was lined and hard. He had the look of someone who hadn't smiled in a long time and wasn't planning to start today. "American?" the man asked. Jimmy nodded. "Captain James Hartwell, 8th Air Force, Wing Commander Marcus Sullivan. They call me Black Mac." He said it without emotion. "Just a fact, like saying the sky is blue or water is wet. You're blocking my runway, Captain." Jimmy felt his face flush. "I apologize, sir. We were hit hard over Schweinfurt. Had to put down wherever we could." Sullivan nodded once. "Schweinfurt. Heard about that. Bad business. Lost 60 planes." Sullivan turned to look at him. His eyes were gray and cold, calculated. He studied Jimmy like a scientist studying an interesting specimen. "You boys flew at 25,000 feet in broad daylight, in neat formations that every German fighter squadron could see from 50 miles away. Tactically, you might as well have painted targets on your fuselages." Jimmy opened his mouth to defend his squadron, to defend American tactics, to defend the entire strategic bombing doctrine that had been drilled into him from his first day in flight school. But the words wouldn't come, because Sullivan was right. They had flown like targets, and they'd been shot down like targets. "With respect," Sir Jimmy finally said, "daylight precision bombing is the most effective way to destroy specific industrial targets." Sullivan almost smiled. "Almost. Effective. Interesting word. Let me ask you something, Captain. If you destroy a factory but lose 26% of your force doing it, is that effective? Or is it just expensive? We have to hit specific targets. Bridges, factories, rail yards. You can't do that at night." Sullivan turned back to watch his crew's debriefing. "Can't we? Last night we hit Castle rail yards. In a storm. Through 10 tenths cloud cover. Using a radio navigation system that lets us bomb through clouds and hit targets we never see with our eyes. Hit them accurately. And we did it with 1% losses." Jimmy didn't have an answer for that. Sullivan studied him again. "You'll be here 6 weeks while they patch you up," Jimmy nodded. Sullivan made a decision. You can see it happening behind his cold gray eyes. Some calculation being made. Some assessment of whether this American captain was worth the effort. "Watch us work, Captain," Sullivan said. "Watch for 6 weeks. Learn how we do things. Then you can go back to your flying fortresses and your daylight raids and your 26% losses if you want." Or you can learn something that might keep you alive. He walked away without waiting for an answer. Jimmy stood there alone on the runway as the sun came up and burned off the morning fog. Around him, Canadian ground crews swarmed over the returned Lancasters, patching holes, replacing engines, getting them ready to fly again tonight. Always tonight, night after night after night. In 6 weeks, Jimmy would make a decision that would change his life. He would request a transfer, would become the only American pilot authorized to fly combat missions with Canadian bomber squadrons, would spend 8 months learning what real air warfare looked like when you stripped away the bravado and the national pride and focused only on what worked. But that was 6 weeks away. Right now, with the sun rising over Yorkshire and the smell of aviation fuel and cigarette smoke drifting across the flight line, Jimmy Hartwell just stood there with broken ribs and burned hands and watched the Canadians prepare to do it all over again. And somewhere in Germany, Klaus Richter was writing in his diary about the Canadian Lancaster he'd shot down after 3 attack runs, about how even wounded it had nearly killed him, about the nightmares he was starting to have, about the growing fear that someday soon he'd face not one wounded Lancaster, but dozens of healthy ones all flying together, all protected by that bomber stream tactic that German intelligence was just beginning to understand. Klaus didn't know that in 6 months he'd meet that bomber stream over Stuttgart. Didn't know he'd be shot down and spend the rest of the war in a POW camp. Didn't know that 30 years later he'd shake hands with the American pilot who'd been aboard one of those Lancasters, and they'd talk about forgiveness and guilt and whether any of it had been worth the cost. None of them knew what was coming. They just knew what they had to do today. Fly, fight, survive if possible, die if necessary. And try not to think too hard about whether the cause justified the cost. Because once you started asking that question, really asking it deeply and honestly, you might not like the answer. And you still had to keep flying anyway. That was the burden. That was the weight. That was what separated the men who could do this job from the men who couldn't. The ability to carry terrible knowledge and still climb back into the cockpit when dawn came and someone pointed at a map and said, "There, that's where we're going tonight." Jimmy would learn that lesson over the next 6 months. Would learn it the hard way, watching friends die, dropping bombs on people he'd never met, making choices that would echo through his dreams for 70 years. But first he had to learn something simpler, something more fundamental, something that would shake his American certainty down to its foundation. He had to learn that being the best doesn't always mean being the loudest or the proudest or the most confident. Sometimes it means being the quietest, the most disciplined, the most willing to do the job without needing glory or recognition or parades. Sometimes the heroes don't wave your flag. And being man enough to admit that, to learn from them, to honor them, even when it costs you your pride. That's American too. October came to Yorkshire with cold rain and gray skies that never seemed to lift. Jimmy Hartwell spent his days watching the Canadians work and his nights lying awake wondering what he'd gotten himself into. His ribs healed slowly. The burns on his hands turned to scars. But something else was healing too, or maybe breaking, depending on how you looked at it. His certainty, his absolute faith in American methods and American superiority. Every day he watched these quiet Canadian farm boys do things he'd been taught were impossible, and every day another piece of his old beliefs crumbled away. He met Technical Sergeant Michael Torres on his 3rd day at the base. Torres was an American liaison officer, 30 years old, from New Mexico. He'd been stationed with the Canadians for 8 months and spoke about them with a respect that bordered on reverence. "They're different," Torres told Jimmy over coffee in the mess hall. "Not better or worse, just different. Americans fly like we're invincible. British fly like they're trying to prove something. Canadians fly like it's a job that needs doing, and they're going to do it right regardless of what anyone thinks." Torres showed Jimmy the classified statistics. Loss rates over 6 months. American daylight raids averaged 7 to 12% losses depending on the target. British night raids with bombers scattered across the sky averaged 8 to 10%. Canadian bomber stream operations averaged 2 to 4%. "That's impossible," Jimmy said. "You can't fly that close together at night without collisions." Torres shrugged. "Tell that to them. They've been doing it for a year now. Perfected the tactic over Cologne last spring. German fighters don't know how to counter it. By the time they engage one bomber, they're surrounded by 50 more, all with gunners trained on them. It's not a fair fight. But war isn't supposed to be fair. Jimmy spent his days observing. He watched pre-flight briefings where Wing Commander Sullivan laid out missions with the emotional investment of a man reading a grocery list. Target coordinates, expected flak concentrations, weather conditions, German fighter activity, all delivered in that flat, cold voice that never wavered. Sullivan didn't give inspiring speeches, didn't tell his crews they were heroes, or that God was on their side, or that they were fighting for freedom and democracy. He just told them where to go and what to PM and approximately how dangerous it would be. The crews listened, took notes, and went to their aircraft. No cheering, no patriotic songs, just men doing a job. The efficiency of it disturbed Jimmy at first. Where was the passion? Where was the fire Americans went to war with bands playing and flags waving? These Canadians went to war like they were going to harvest wheat, methodical, systematic, relentless. But he began to understand that the lack of emotion was itself a kind of strength. Passion burns out. Enthusiasm fades. But discipline, cold and steady and unbreakable, that lasts. That keeps you flying night after night when every mission might be your last. That lets you climb back into the cockpit after watching your wingman explode because the job isn't finished and someone has to finish it. He watched them prepare their bombers. The ground crews worked with a precision that reminded him of Swiss watchmakers. Every rivet checked, every system tested, every gauge calibrated. Nothing left to chance. The Canadians flew older aircraft than the Americans. Their Lancasters weren't as new or as shiny as the latest B-17s rolling off American assembly lines. But they maintained them better, treated them like the life support systems they were. In his second week, Jimmy was standing near the flight line when a Lancaster crew walked past on their way to their aircraft. The pilot, a young man who looked barely old enough to shave, noticed Jimmy watching. The pilot stopped, extended his hand. Flight Lieutenant David Cole. Jimmy shook it. Captain James Hartwell, American 8th Air Force. Cole smiled. It was a gentle smile, the kind that made you trust someone immediately. I know. You're the one who blocked our runway. No hard feelings. War's chaotic. Things happen. Cole's crew gathered around. The rear gunner, a stocky kid with a farmer's build and calloused hands, introduced himself as Tommy Reed. From Manitoba, he said. Used to hunt moose in the dark. This is easier. Moose don't shoot back. The navigator, Peter Walsh, was older, maybe 25. Had the careful, precise manner of a mathematics teacher, which is what he'd been before the war. The bomb aimer, the flight engineer, the radio operator, all of them young, all of them carrying themselves with a quiet competence that Jimmy found both impressive and slightly intimidating. Cole gestured toward their Lancaster. Northern Star, he said, 68 missions so far. She's been good to us, hasn't let us down yet. 68 missions. Jimmy tried to imagine flying 68 combat missions. He'd flown 13 counting the Schweinfurt disaster and felt like an old man. You ever been inside a Lancaster? Cole asked. Jimmy shook his head. Come on, I'll show you. The interior of a Lancaster was different from a B-17. Narrower, more cramped, darker. The pilot sat high in the nose, surrounded by instruments that glowed green in the darkness. The bomb aimer lay in the nose below and forward of the pilot, staring down through a clear panel at the ground 7 miles below. The navigator worked in a tiny curtained alcove hunched over maps and calculations by the light of a single dim bulb. The rear gunner's position made Jimmy's skin crawl. Tommy Reed had to crawl backward through the fuselage, squeeze through a tiny opening, and lock himself into a plexiglass turret with 2 machine guns and no armor plating between him and eternity. If the aircraft was hit and went down, the rear gunner had maybe 5 seconds to rotate his turret crawl back through that tiny opening and reach a parachute. Most didn't make it. You sit back here for how long? Jimmy asked. Tommy shrugged. 4 hours, 6. However long the mission takes, gets cold. Feet go numb. But the view's incredible. You can see the whole sky. See the fighters coming before anyone else. It's my job to keep them off us. He said it like it was nothing. Like volunteering to be the most exposed, most vulnerable, most likely to die member of the crew was just another job that needed doing. Cole showed Jimmy the bomb bay, showed him how a Lancaster could carry 22,000 pounds of bombs, almost 3 times what a B-17 could manage. Showed him the fuel tanks, the oxygen system, the intricate network of cables and wires, and hydraulic lines that kept the bomber flying. She's a good aircraft, Cole said, patting the fuselage like you'd pat a horse. Reliable, tough. Brings us home when by all rights we should be dead. I pray for her every night. Thank God for the men who built her. Ask him to keep her flying one more mission. You're religious, Jimmy asked. Cole nodded. My father's a pastor, Baptist Church in Saskatchewan. Population of the town, 342. I grew up believing God watches over us. Used to think that meant he'd protect me. Now I think it means he'll forgive me for what I have to do. There's a difference. They stood there in the cold morning air. Two pilots from different countries, different cultures, different air forces, both trying to make sense of a war that made less sense the longer you fought it. Do you ever wonder, Jimmy asked, if what we're doing is right? Cole was quiet for a long moment, watching his crew finish their pre-flight checks. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft. Every single day, every time I drop bombs on a city, I wonder about the people below. Factory workers, their families, children, old people. The Germans started this war, yes. Their government is evil, yes. But the woman working in a munitions factory? Is she evil or is she just trying to feed her children? I don't know the answer, Captain. I just know that if I don't bomb that factory, more Allied soldiers die. More concentration camps keep operating. More cities get invaded. So I do the math. I make the choice. And I live with it. Or I try to. What does your father say? Cole smiled sadly. He says that God gave us free will and terrible choices, and we have to do our best with both. He says that righteousness and necessity aren't always the same thing. And he says that when this war is over, I should come home and help him rebuild his church. Work with my hands. Create instead of destroy. Try to balance the scales. I'm looking forward to that. If I survive. You'll survive, Jimmy said. Cole looked at him with those gentle eyes. Maybe, or maybe not. Either way, the bombs still have to be dropped. The job still has to be done. That's what Sullivan understands. That's why we follow him. Not because he makes us feel good about it, because he's honest about what it costs. That conversation stayed with Jimmy, echoed in his mind during the long nights when he couldn't sleep. David Cole had flown 68 combat missions and still questioned whether what he was doing was right. That took a different kind of courage than Jimmy had known existed. The courage to keep doing a necessary thing even when you weren't sure it was a righteous thing. To carry that doubt and still climb back into the cockpit night after night. The courage not of certainty but of commitment. Not of blind faith but of open-eyed acceptance of terrible choices. In his fourth week at the base, Sullivan called Jimmy to his office. The wing commander sat behind a desk covered in maps and reports and loss statistics. He gestured for Jimmy to sit. Your ribs are healed, Sullivan said. Medical officer says you're fit to fly. Jimmy nodded. Sullivan opened a folder. Pulled out a document, slid it across the desk. German Luftwaffe internal intelligence report. Captured 2 weeks ago by special operations. They don't know we have it. You can't share this with anyone until after the war ends. Understood. Jimmy nodded again. He read the report. It was in German, but someone had translated it. The statistics made his blood run cold. German pilot survival rates against different Allied bomber forces. Against American daylight bombers, 85% of German pilots survived each mission. Against scattered British night bombers, 81%. Against Canadian bomber stream operations, 68%. The Canadians were killing German pilots at nearly double the rate of American operations. The report concluded with a recommendation that shocked Jimmy even more. German High Command was considering allowing pilots to refuse missions against Canadian bomber streams without facing court-martial. They'd never issued an order like that before. It meant the Luftwaffe, the feared German Air Force that had terrorized Europe, was admitting they couldn't stop the Canadians. Sullivan watched Jimmy read, waited until he finished. We've broken them, Sullivan said. Not completely, not yet. But we've broken their will. They know they can't win against the bomber stream. They fly anyway because they have to, because their commanders order them to, because they're soldiers, and soldiers follow orders. But they know. And that knowledge is killing them as surely as our bullets. Why are you showing me this? Jimmy asked. Because I'm going to make you an offer. Fly one mission with us. Just one. As an observer, ride in David Cole's aircraft. See what we do. Then you can go back to your B-17s and your daylight raids if you want, or you can stay. Learn from us. Maybe teach your people what actually works instead of what makes good propaganda. Jimmy thought about it. Thought about Tommy Garcia bleeding out in the waist gun position. Thought about 60 B-17s burning across Germany. Thought about loss rates that meant the average American bomber crew had a coin flip's chance of surviving 25 missions. One mission, he said. Sullivan almost smiled. One mission. Target is Cologne. November 3rd. Weather's going to be terrible. Perfect flying conditions for us. Hell for everyone else. The days leading up to November 3rd felt like waiting for execution. Jimmy tried to maintain the confidence he'd always had, the certainty that he was a good pilot who'd faced death before and come through fine. But that confidence felt hollow now. Flying in daylight with visibility for miles was one thing. Flying at night in a storm, trusting your life to instruments and the skills of men you barely knew, that was something else entirely. David Cole's crew treated him with patient kindness. Tommy Reed taught him how to see at night using peripheral vision, letting your eyes adjust to darkness instead of fighting it. Walsh showed him the GH navigation system, explaining the mathematics of radio triangulation with the enthusiasm of a professor who'd found an interested student. Cole himself spent hours talking to Jimmy about instrument flying, about trusting the gauges, even when your body screamed that they were wrong. The hardest lesson was about trust. In a B-17, each position was isolated. The pilot flew, the gunner shot, the bombardier aimed. You worked together but separately. In a Lancaster, everyone was connected. The navigator guided the pilot. The bomb aimer corrected course during the run. The gunners called out threats that the pilot reacted to instantly. If one person failed, everyone died. You have to trust us, Cole said the day before the mission. Trust that I won't fly us into the ground. Trust that Walsh will navigate through clouds. Trust that Tommy will keep the fighters off our tail. And we have to trust you not to panic when it gets bad. Because it will get bad. It always does. November 3rd dawned gray and cold. Rain hammering against the barracks windows. Wind gusting to 30 miles per hour. Jimmy stood in the briefing room with 97 Lancaster crews and listened to Sullivan describe the mission. Target Cologne. Rail yards and industrial facilities. 97 aircraft, bomber stream formation, estimated time over target 45 minutes. Expected flak heavy, expected fighter. Opposition moderate to heavy, weather 10 tenths cloud cover, rain poor visibility. In other words, perfect. Some of the crews chuckled. Dark humor, the kind you develop when you fly into hell every night and somehow keep coming back. Sullivan's eyes found Jimmy in the crowd, held his gaze for a moment, then moved on. Gentlemen, Sullivan said the British want us to cancel due to weather. I informed them that Canadians fly in weather that keeps ducks on the ground. We launch at 1800 hours. Dismissed. The crews filed out. Jimmy felt his heart pounding, felt sweat on his palms despite the cold. This was real. This was happening. In 6 hours, he'd be in the air over Germany with no visibility and no way to see what was trying to kill him. Cole found him outside the briefing room, put a hand on his shoulder. You'll be fine, Cole said. We've done this 97 times. Tonight will be 98, then 99, then 100. One mission at a time, that's all we can control. What if something goes wrong? Then we improvise, adapt, survive if we can, but probably we'll be fine. Probably it'll be routine. Most missions are just long, cold, boring flights with a few minutes of terror in the middle. You learn to endure the boredom and survive the terror. That's the job. But Cole's hand on Jimmy's shoulder was shaking slightly, just a tremor, barely noticeable. And Jimmy understood Cole was scared too, had been scared for all 97 missions, would be scared for every mission after. The difference was that Cole flew anyway. Fear didn't stop him, it just made him more careful. They walked to Northern Star together. The ground crew was finishing final checks. Tommy Reed was already climbing into his rear turret. Walsh was setting up his navigation station. Everything proceeding with mechanical precision. Jimmy climbed aboard, took the second co-pilot position, a tiny fold-down seat behind him between Cole and his regular co-pilot. No controls, just a place to sit and observe and try not to get in the way. The 4 Packard Merlin engines started one at a time. The sound was incredible, physical. each engine producing 1,640 horsepower. Jimmy could feel it in his bones, in his teeth, in his chest where his heart was trying to break through his ribs. Cole ran through his checklist with the same calm voice he'd used to order breakfast. Fuel mixture rich, props set, trim adjusted, all instruments green. Then they were taxiing, one Lancaster every 45 seconds, 97 bombers, all painted black, all carrying 22,000 pounds of bombs, all flying into weather that had grounded every other Allied operation. Northern Star reached the runway. Cole advanced the throttles. The Lancaster surged forward heavy with fuel and bombs, picking up speed slowly. 40 miles per hour, 60, 80. The tail came up. The rumbling of wheels on concrete stopped, and suddenly they were airborne, climbing into rain and darkness. And Jimmy couldn't see anything. Not the ground, not the sky, not the other bombers he knew were 50 feet away on either side. Just the green glow of instruments and the red exhaust flames from the engines in absolute darkness beyond the windscreen. His body screamed that something was wrong, that they were upside down, that they were diving, that they were about to crash. Every instinct demanded he grab the controls and level the aircraft. But Cole sat there calm and steady, watching the artificial horizon, making tiny corrections, trusting the instruments when his body lied to him. "Trust the gauges," Cole said quietly. "Not your instincts. Your instincts will kill you at night. The gauges tell the truth." They climbed to 18,000 feet, still in clouds, still completely blind. Jimmy's hands gripped the edge of his seat so hard his knuckles went white. Walsh's voice over the intercom, calm and steady. On course. On time. Crossing English coast now. They were over water, over the North Sea. Still couldn't see anything. Just trust that the other bombers were where they were supposed to be. Trust that everyone was flying the same heading, at the same speed, at the same altitude. Trust that the mathematics worked. "German coast ahead," Walsh said, entering hostile airspace. And that's when the flak started. Jimmy had experienced anti-aircraft fire before. In daylight, you could see it. Black puffs appearing in the sky. You could dodge, weave, take evasive action. At night in clouds, you couldn't see anything until the shell exploded close enough to light up the darkness. A flash of orange, a bang that shook the aircraft, fragments of hot metal pinging against aluminum skin, then darkness again. Cole didn't dodge, didn't weave. Held steady on course because in a bomber stream, taking evasive action meant colliding with the aircraft next to you. You flew straight, trusted in numbers and chaos to keep you alive. The flak intensified, constant explosions, the smell of cordite seeping into the aircraft. Jimmy's mouth went dry. His vision narrowed to a tunnel. This was worse than daylight combat. At least in daylight, you could see death coming. Fighters Tommy Reed called from the rear turret. 3 Messerschmitts at 7 o'clock high. Reed's guns opened fire. Tracer rounds arcing out into the darkness. The stutter of machine guns competing with the roar of engines. Jimmy twisted in his seat, trying to see, seeing nothing but muzzle flashes in darkness. "Got one," Reed shouted. "Splash one, Fritz." The other 2 fighters broke off, disappeared into the clouds, probably looking for easier targets. "Approaching initial point," Walsh said. "Bomb run in 3 minutes. Cole took a deep breath, flexed his hands on the controls. This was it. The moment when they had to fly straight and level no matter what. No evasion, no defensive maneuvers. Just hold course while the bomb aimer lined up the target and every gun in Cologne fired at them. Bomb bay doors open. The aircraft shuddered. Wind screaming through the open bay. Jimmy could feel the cold, could smell smoke and chemicals and fear. "Steady," the bomb aimer called. "Steady." Left a touch. "Good. Hold it there." Time stretched, seconds feeling like hours, flak bursting all around them, the aircraft jolting from near misses, metal pinging, someone screaming on the radio. Another Lancaster hit, going down, crew bailing out into night and chaos. Bombs away. The Lancaster leaped upward, free of 22,000 pounds. Northern Star climbed and turned for home, and below them Cologne erupted in fire. Jimmy risked a glance down through a break in the clouds. Saw the city burning. Fire spreading block by block. Secondary explosions, smoke rising thousands of feet, and more Lancasters coming behind them. Wave after wave. The bomber stream pouring death onto the city below. It was horrific. It was beautiful. It was the most terrible thing Jimmy had ever seen, and he couldn't look away. They flew home in silence, each man alone with his thoughts, with what they'd done, with what they'd witnessed. Northern Star landed at 02:30 hours. 97 Lancasters had launched. 96 came home. One had been shot down over Cologne. 7 men dead. Jimmy climbed out of the aircraft on shaking legs, stood on solid ground and wanted to kiss it, wanted to laugh or cry or scream, wanted to never fly again. Cole walked over, lit a cigarette with hands that trembled slightly. Well, Jimmy couldn't find words at first. Finally managed, "How do you do that every night?" Cole took a long drag on his cigarette, blew smoke into the cold morning air. "One mission at a time," he said. "That's the only way. Think about tonight's mission. Don't think about tomorrow's. Don't think about the next 100, just tonight. And you trust your crew, and trust your aircraft, and trust that most of the time the odds favor survival. Most of the time. But not always. No, not always. But what choice do we have? The war doesn't stop because we're tired or scared. The Germans don't surrender because we've had enough, so we fly. We drop our bombs. We come home if we can, and we try to remember that we're the good guys, that what we're destroying is evil, that the cost, terrible as it is less than the cost of letting Hitler win." Do you believe that Cole looked at him with those gentle eyes? Most days, yes. Some days, no. But I fly anyway. That's the real test, isn't it? Not whether you're certain you're right, but whether you keep doing your duty even when certainty fails. Jimmy spent that night and the next day and the next week thinking about what Cole had said, about duty and certainty, about necessary evil and impossible choices, about men who fly into darkness night after night, not because they're sure they're heroes, but because someone has to and they've been chosen to do it. And somewhere in Germany, Klaus Richter was writing in his diary about the Cologne raid, about how he'd scrambled with 32 other night fighters, about how the radar showed a solid wall of bombers, and he'd known, absolutely known, that most of his squadron wouldn't survive the night, about how he'd fired on a Lancaster and thought he'd hit it, but couldn't confirm because 3 other Lancasters immediately closed formation around the damaged one and forced him to break off, about how his wingman had exploded right in front of him, hit by defensive fire from 6 bombers at once. Klaus wrote, "They don't fly like individuals. They fly like a single organism, like a school of fish or a flock of birds. Attack one and the whole formation responds. We've never faced anything like it. And I don't think we can stop it." He was right, but it would take 3 more months and thousands more deaths before even the German high command admitted it. 3 more months before they issued that unprecedented order allowing pilots to refuse missions against Canadian bomber streams. 3 more months before the night Klaus Richter scrambled to intercept the Stuttgart raid and finally understood that you cannot stop a force of nature. You can only survive it if you're lucky, or die trying if you're not. That night was coming. March 15th, 1944, when Jimmy Hartwell would fly his 23rd combat mission, when David Cole would fly his 93rd, when Klaus Richter would fly his last. The night when 3 men from 3 different worlds would converge in the burning sky over Germany, and only 2 of them would land their aircraft afterward. March 15th, 1944. The briefing room at RAF Linton on Ouse held 371 Lancaster crews, the largest gathering of Canadian bomber force in history. Jimmy Hartwell stood at the back and watched Wing Commander Marcus Sullivan step to the podium. 5 months had passed since that first mission over Cologne. 5 months during which Jimmy had flown 22 more combat missions with various Canadian squadrons. 23 total now. He'd watched bombers explode. He'd helped pull wounded crews from crashed aircraft. He'd learned what it meant to fly night after night into darkness, knowing that statistics said your luck would eventually run out. He was a different man than the cocky B-17 pilot who'd crashed here last September. Quieter, harder, less certain about everything except this: the Canadians had figured out something the rest of the Allies hadn't. They'd found a way to win at an acceptable cost. And tonight they were going to prove it on a scale no one had attempted before. Sullivan looked out at the assembled crews. His face was gray with exhaustion, dark circles under his eyes. He hadn't slept well in months, maybe years. The weight of sending thousands of young men to D showed in every line of his face. Gentlemen, Sullivan began, his voice flat and cold as always. Target tonight is Stuttgart, Germany's automotive manufacturing center. Makes engines for tanks, trucks, aircraft. Critical to their war effort. We're going to destroy it. Full of it. In one night. He gestured to the map behind him. 371 Lancasters. Largest bomber stream ever attempted. Will arrive over target in 3 waves across 52 minutes. First wave drops target markers. Second wave drops the main payload. Third wave finishes anything still standing. Estimated bomb load 2,574 tons. That's enough explosive power to level 15 square miles of industrial infrastructure. The room was silent. Even for men who'd flown dozens of missions, this was unprecedented. 371 aircraft flying in formation through darkness. The logistics alone were staggering. The danger was almost unimaginable. Expected losses, Sullivan continued, 5 to 6%. That's 18 to 22 aircraft. Between 126 and 154 men who won't come home. I wish I could promise you all safe return. I can't. All I can promise is that if we succeed tonight, we shorten this war. Maybe by weeks, maybe by months. Every factory we destroy is 10 fewer tanks on the battlefield. Every tank that doesn't get built is Allied soldiers who live instead of die. That's the math. Brutal but simple. He paused, looked across the room at faces that were too young and too old at the same time. You've trained for this. You're ready for this. Trust your crews. Trust your aircraft. Trust the bomber stream. We've broken the Luftwaffe's will. Tonight we break their capacity to fight. Questions. No one spoke. We launch at 1800 hours. Dismissed. Jimmy found David Cole outside the briefing room. Cole was lighting a cigarette, his 93rd mission ritual. His hands were steady, but his eyes looked tired. Not physically tired, soul tired. The exhaustion that comes from doing terrible things for necessary reasons, month after month, with no end in sight. You're flying with us again, Cole asked. If you'll have me. Always room for a Yank who's willing to learn. Cole smiled that gentle smile. Though I have to say, after 23 missions with us, you're practically Canadian now. Should get you a maple leaf patch for your jacket. I'd be honored to wear it. They walked toward Northern Star together. The ground crew was already swarming over her, loading bombs, fueling tanks, checking every system with obsessive care. This would be Northern Star's 93rd mission too. 93 times she'd carried them into combat. 93 times she'd brought them home. Cole patted the fuselage like you'd pat an old friend. One more time, girl, just one more tonight. Then we rest. Then we do it again tomorrow. Tommy Reed was already in his rear turret position. Jimmy climbed up to say hello, found the young Manitoba farm boy checking his guns with ritualistic precision. How do you do it, Jimmy asked. Sit back here mission after mission, knowing you're the most exposed position on the aircraft, Tommy shrugged. Someone has to. Might as well be someone who's good at it. Besides, I like the view. Gets cold and lonely, sure. But when those fighters come, I'm the first to see them. First to engage. I keep my crew safe. That's worth any price. You ever get scared? Every single time. But my dad used to say, fear is just your body getting ready to do nothing difficult. So I thank the fear, let it sharpen my senses, make me faster, more alert. Then I do my job. Simple as that. A 21-year-old kid with ice water in his veins and a philosophy that would make ancient Stoics proud. Peter Walsh was hunched over his navigation station, calculating courses and fuel loads. He looked up when Jimmy appeared. Biggest mission of the war, Walsh said. If we pull this off, every bomber command and every air force will study this operation for decades. We're writing history tonight. Whether that makes me proud or terrified, I haven't decided yet. Can it be both? Walsh smiled. I suppose it can. I suppose that's the only honest response to what we do. Pride and terror, glory and guilt. We destroy cities to save civilization. We kill to stop killing. The contradictions never resolve. You just learn to carry them. The philosophical navigator, the gentle pilot, the fearless gunner. Cole's crew was a collection of unlikely warriors, and Jimmy had come to love them like brothers, which made the statistics even harder to bear. 5 to 6% losses tonight. Odds were good that some of these men he'd come to know wouldn't see dawn. The engine started, that physical roar that turned your bones to tuning forks. 4 Packard Merlins per aircraft, 371 aircraft, 1,484 engines, all starting within an hour of each other. The sound rolled across Yorkshire like thunder that wouldn't stop. They taxied to the runway, one Lancaster every 30 seconds. It took 3 hours for all 371 bombers to take off. By the time Northern Star reached the runway, the first wave was already crossing the English Channel. Cole ran through his checklist. Everything green, everything ready. He took a deep breath, whispered his prayer, then advanced the throttles, and Northern Star rolled down the runway and lifted into the gathering dusk. They climbed to 18,000 feet, joined the bomber stream. 371 black Lancasters flying in a column that stretched across 50 miles of sky. Jimmy couldn't see them, but he knew they were there. 50 feet to the left, 50 feet to the right, above, below, all around, a river of metal and bombs and men flowing toward Germany. The sun set behind them, darkness fell, and the bomber stream flew on, crossing German coast, Walsh reported. Hostile airspace. Estimate time to target 42 minutes. Far below them in a Luftwaffe operations room outside Stuttgart, controllers stared at radar screens and tried to make sense of what they were seeing. A formation so dense it looked like a single massive aircraft. Reports came in from observers on the ground. The sound of engines. Thousands of engines, the entire sky vibrating with their passage. And in a small airfield outside Munich, Klaus Richter sat in his Messerschmitt Bf 110 and listened to his commander's voice over the radio. All aircraft scramble. Massive formation inbound to Stuttgart. Estimate 300 plus bombers. Canadian bomber stream. I repeat, Canadian bomber stream. Klaus felt his hands start shaking, felt his breath catch in his throat. Not again, not the Canadians again. He'd barely survived the last encounter. Had nightmares every night about that wall of bombers, that storm of defensive fire, that helpless feeling of flying into death with no way to stop it. His radar operator, Hans Meyer, climbed into the seat behind him. Hans was 25 years old and trying hard not to show his fear. Failing. Klaus, Hans said quietly, "We don't have to do this. Command said pilots can refuse missions against Canadian formations. No court-martial. We could say the engines won't start, say the radar is broken, say anything." Klaus was tempted, so tempted, to just sit there and let this nightmare pass, to survive one more night, to maybe live through this war and see his mother again. But his wingmen were taking off. His squadron mates, boys he'd flown with for 2 years. If they were going up, how could he stay down? What kind of man refused to fly when his brothers were flying? He started the engines, taxied to the runway, took off into darkness. They climbed toward the bomber stream. Klaus's radar showed it clearly now. Not a formation, a wall, a solid barrier of aircraft stretching from horizon to horizon. He'd never seen anything like it. Never imagined anything like it was possible. "How do we fight that?" Hans whispered. "We don't," Klaus said. "We just try to survive it." They approached the stream from above and behind. Klaus picked a target, a single Lancaster slightly separated from the others. Maybe damaged, maybe just unlucky. He dove. His cannons opened fire, tracer rounds lighting up the darkness. He saw hits, saw pieces flying off the Lancaster, saw flame from an engine. But before he could confirm the kill, the sky erupted in defensive fire. Not from one bomber, from 5. From 10. Tracer rounds from every direction. The Lancasters hadn't scattered. They'd closed formation around the damaged one, turned the entire section of the bomber stream into a fortress of interlocking fire. Klaus felt impacts on his aircraft. Port engine hit, oil pressure dropping, temperature rising. He tried to break off, but more fire converged on him. The Canadians weren't just defending themselves. They were hunting him. "We're hit!" Hans screamed. "Port engine on fire. We have to bail out." Klaus fought the controls. The Messerschmitt was spinning, going down. He could smell smoke, could feel heat from the engine fire spreading. "Eject," he shouted. "Eject now." They blew the canopy. Cold air screamed into the cockpit. Hans went first, tumbling into darkness. Klaus grabbed his own ejection handles and pulled. The seat kicked him out into the night sky. Wind tearing at him, temperature 40 below zero. He pulled his ripcord and the parachute snapped open, and suddenly he was floating, drifting down through darkness, watching his fighter plane spiral toward the ground trailing fire. He looked up, saw the bomber stream passing overhead, saw the red glow of hundreds of engines, heard the thunder of thousands of horsepower. It looked like the sky itself was on fire, like the apocalypse it was flying overhead and he was falling through it into hell. He landed in rubble, in what used to be a neighborhood in Stuttgart. The first wave of bombers had already passed. Buildings were burning, people screaming, fire spreading block by block. Klaus stumbled through smoke and flames, found a woman and her two children dead in a basement shelter, killed by the collapse of their building, or maybe by the shock wave from a near miss. He'd never know, would never need to know. The only thing that mattered was that they were dead, and he'd been trying to stop it, and he'd failed. He sat down in the rubble next to their bodies and watched Stuttgart burn around him, watched wave after wave of Canadian Lancasters fly overhead, dropping their bombs. 52 minutes of continuous bombing, the earth shaking, the air filled with smoke and dust and the smell of explosives and burning wood and death. And Klaus Richter understood something in that moment, understood it with a clarity that would stay with him for the rest of his life. You cannot stop a force of nature. You cannot fight a hurricane or an earthquake or a bomber stream of 371 Lancasters flown by men who refuse to quit. All you can do is endure it if you're lucky, or die in it if you're not. Above him, Jimmy Hartwell sat in Northern Star and watched Stuttgart die. They were in the second wave, flying straight and level on the bomb run. Walsh calling corrections, the bomb aimer lining up the target, flak bursting all around them, but Cole holding steady, trusting the bomber stream, trusting that numbers and chaos would keep them alive. Bombs away. Northern Star jumped upward, free of her deadly cargo, and below, Stuttgart erupted. Jimmy saw it clearly, fires spreading, buildings collapsing, industrial complexes exploding in chains of secondary detonations, a city dying beneath him. He thought about the people down there, factory workers, their families, old people, children, all the German equivalents of Tommy Garcia and David Cole and everyone Jimmy had ever known. People who probably didn't want this war any more than he did, but were trapped in it anyway. People who were dying because their government had started something it couldn't finish, and now everyone had to pay the price. Northern Star turned for home, climbed above the smoke, joined the stream of bombers heading back to England. Behind them, Stuttgart burned with fires that would burn for 3 days. They landed at 02:45 hours. 371 Lancasters launched, 353 returned, 18 lost, 126 Canadian airmen dead. Jimmy climbed out of Northern Star on legs that barely worked, stood on solid ground, and felt something break inside him. Not his courage, not his commitment, but his certainty that any of this was simple or clean or righteous. Cole found him standing alone near the aircraft. The pilot looked old in the pre-dawn light, gray and exhausted and carrying weight that would never fully lift. "We did it," Cole said quietly. "Destroyed 83% of Stuttgart's industrial capacity. Intelligence estimates German production will drop 60% in the next month. Tanks that won't be built, guns that won't be made, soldiers on the Eastern Front who might live because we destroyed the factories that would have armed the troops sent to kill them." He paused, lit a cigarette with shaking hands. "Doesn't feel like victory though, does it?" "No," Jimmy said. "It feels like we just committed mass murder with paperwork that says it was legal." Cole nodded slowly. "That's the burden we carry. That knowledge, that guilt. Sullivan told me once we shortened the war tonight. Maybe by weeks, maybe by months. Saved thousands of lives by taking hundreds. The math works. But the math doesn't make you sleep better at night. The math doesn't stop the ghosts." They stood there in silence as the sun rose over Yorkshire. As the last of the Lancasters landed and the crew stumbled to debriefing, and everyone tried not to think too hard about the 18 empty spaces where friends used to be. Jimmy requested permanent transfer to Canadian 6th Group that week, became an official liaison officer, flew combat missions for the next 13 months until Germany surrendered in May 1945, saw dozens more cities burn, watched dozens more crews die, learned that courage isn't about not being afraid or not being guilty, it's about carrying both and doing your duty anyway. When the war ended, he wrote a detailed report to American Air Force Command, 50 pages documenting Canadian bomber stream tactics, recommending adoption across all Allied air forces, concluding that the Canadians had developed the most effective strategic bombing doctrine of the war, and America needed to learn from them. The response came back 3 weeks later. One paragraph. Thank you for your observations. American daylight precision bombing achieved the destruction of critical German infrastructure and was the primary factor in Allied air superiority. Your service is noted. They weren't going to admit it. Couldn't admit it. American pride wouldn't allow the admission that colonials had done it better. Jimmy went home to Texas, became a commercial airline pilot, flew safe, predictable routes, and every night dreamed about Stuttgart burning. David Cole went home to Saskatchewan, became a pastor like his father, spent 40 years trying to balance the destruction he'd caused with the lives he'd saved. Never quite managed it, but kept trying anyway. Marcus Sullivan retired to a farm in Ontario, refused interviews, refused honors, lived quietly until his death in 1967. Most of Canada never knew his name. And Klaus Richter spent 18 months in a POW camp and then went home to a destroyed Germany and became a teacher. Spent 30 years trying to make sense of what men do to each other in war, trying to forgive himself for fighting for evil, even though he hadn't known it was evil at the time, trying to understand if following orders was a defense or just an excuse. 30 years passed. The world moved on. The war became history. The men who'd fought it became old. And the stories got buried under other stories until almost everyone forgot. Almost. In 1970, the Royal Air Force Museum in Hendon, England, dedicated a Lancaster Mech-X exhibit, one of the actual bombers from the war restored and preserved. They invited veterans to the ceremony. Jimmy Hartwell came. He was 54 years old now, gray hair, lines in his face, still flying for Pan Am, but thinking about retirement. He stood in front of that Lancaster and remembered everything: the cold, the darkness, the fear, the fire, the men who'd died, the men who'd survived but carried scars that never showed. He was standing there lost in memory when someone spoke behind him with a German accent. Captain Hartwell. Jimmy turned, saw a man about his age, gray hair, scarred hands, eyes that had seen too much and remembered everything. I read your book, the man said. The Black Stream. Very accurate account. I was there that night. Stuttgart, March 15th, 1944. Jimmy's heart stopped. You were Luftwaffe. The man nodded. Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, night fighter pilot. 11 kills before the war ended, or 11 kills and a guilty conscience depending on how you count it. They stared at each other. Former enemies, meeting in peace 3 decades after trying to kill each other in the dark sky over Germany. I shot down your bomber, Klaus said, or tried to. Northern Star. I remember the registration number. I remember watching you turn for home. I remember being glad you made it because by then I was falling through the sky and watching my fighter burn and thinking at least someone would survive this madness. Jimmy found his voice. You bailed out over Stuttgart. Klaus nodded. Landed in the rubble. Watched the city burn. Found a woman and 2 children dead in a basement. For 30 years, I've wondered, did your bombs kill them or did my government kill them by starting a war we couldn't win? I still don't know the answer. Before Jimmy could respond, another voice joined them. I think maybe both. I think maybe neither. I think maybe war kills and the rest is just details we use to make ourselves feel better. They turned. David Cole stood there. Older now, 62, retired from his church, but still with those gentle eyes that had seen hell and chosen forgiveness anyway. Jimmy introduced them. Klaus, this is Flight Lieutenant David Cole, pilot of Northern Star, the man who brought me home 23 times. Klaus extended his hand slowly. You're the Lancaster I couldn't shoot down. January 1944. Over Hamburg. I attacked you 3 times. Cole took his hand, shook it firmly. I remember you hit our number 2 engine. We made it home on 3. Your aim was good. Our engineer was better. I tried to kill you and I tried to kill you, Cole said it gently, without accusation, just stating fact. We were soldiers, following orders, doing our duty, but that's over now. We're not soldiers anymore. We're just old men trying to make peace with what we did when we were young. They stood there together. Three men who'd been enemies, who tried to kill each other, who'd succeeded in killing each other's friends, now standing in front of a Lancaster bomber in a museum and trying to understand if any of it had meaning beyond the horror. I need to ask you something, Klaus said. Both of you. Was it worth it? The bombing? The destruction? The hundreds of thousands of civilians who died? Did it accomplish anything that justified the camera? Jimmy and David looked at each other. Had this same conversation 100 times over the years. Never found a satisfying answer. Germany surrendered, Jimmy said finally. Concentration camps were liberated. Hitler was stopped. Europe was freed. That happened partly because we destroyed Germany's capacity to fight. So yes, in those terms, it was worth it. But David added, we killed people who weren't soldiers. People who were just trying to survive. People like your mother, Klaus. Like my mother. Like everyone's mother. We burned cities. Destroyed homes, traumatized a generation. So no, in those terms, it wasn't worth it. Both things are true. The war needed to be won. The cost of winning was terrible. Those facts don't cancel each other out. We just have to carry both. Klaus was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that Jimmy would remember for the rest of his life. In the POW camp, I met Canadian bomber crews. Guards, men who'd been wounded and grounded. We talked. They told me about their farms, their families, their hopes for after the war. They were kind to us, shared cigarettes, shared food, treated us like human beings even though we'd been trying to kill them weeks before. I asked one of them why. Why be kind to your enemy? And he said the war made us enemies. Peace makes us neighbors. I get to choose which one matters more. David smiled. That sounds like a Canadian. They walked through the museum together, three old men who'd been young warriors, who'd done terrible things for necessary reasons, who'd survived when so many hadn't, who carried guilt and pride and sorrow and wisdom in equal measure. Jimmy stopped in front of a plaque listing Canadian six-group casualties, 5,698 names, each one a young man who'd climbed into a Lancaster and never come home, each one a life that could have been. Children never born, grandchildren never held, futures erased. This is why I wrote the book, Jimmy said. Why I've spent 30 years trying to tell this story. Not because the Canadians were better than Americans or British or anyone else, but because they did a job that needed doing, and they did it well, and they paid a terrible price and then everyone forgot. They deserve better than that. They deserve the truth. What is the truth, Klaus asked. That war is horror, David said. That victory comes at a cost that echoes through generations. That the men who fight wars are just men doing their best with impossible choices. That courage isn't about being fearless or certain. It's about doing your duty while carrying doubt and guilt and sorrow. And that forgiveness, real forgiveness, starts with admitting that your enemy was human too. They stood there in silence, 30 years of nightmares and guilt and survivor's remorse hanging between them. But also something else, understanding, empathy, the recognition that they had all been trapped in the same machinery of war, and they had all done what they thought was right at the time, and they all had to live with the consequences. I forgive you, Klaus said suddenly, for Stuttgart, for the bombs, for my friends who died. I forgive you because holding on to hate would mean they died for nothing, would mean the war never really ended. So I choose forgiveness. I choose peace. David put his hand on Klaus's shoulder. And I forgive you for Hamburg, for trying to shoot us down, for fighting for a regime that committed evil. I forgive you because you were a soldier like I was, following orders like I was, and I believe that most people are good even when they're caught up in bad systems. Jimmy felt tears on his face, didn't try to hide them. These are my brothers, he said. Both of you. We were enemies once, but we're brothers now, brothers in carrying the weight, brothers in trying to make sense of it. Brothers in choosing peace over hate. The museum was closing. Other visitors were leaving. But the three old men stood there a few minutes longer, remembering, grieving, forgiving, choosing to let the war finally end. Outside, the sun was setting over London, golden light on gray buildings, the city Hitler had tried to destroy, rebuilt, and thriving. Life going on, children playing, people laughing, the world that their war had made possible. Was it worth it? Klaus asked one more time. Yes and no. David answered. Yes, because evil was stopped. No, because the cost was terrible. Both answers are true, we just have to carry them both. They parted with handshakes that turned into embraces. Three old men who'd once been enemies, now friends, carrying scars that would never heal, but choosing not to let those scars define them. Jimmy flew home to Texas, wrote a new chapter for his book about the reunion, about forgiveness, about how the true victory wasn't the destruction of Germany, but the peace that came after. The choice to build instead of destroy, to forgive instead of hate. David went back to Saskatchewan, preached a sermon about reconciliation that made half his congregation cry, talked about meeting the enemy and finding a brother, about how God's grace is big enough to cover even the horrors of war. Klaus went back to Germany, kept teaching, kept trying to help the next generation understand what their grandparents had done and why it must never happen again. Kept choosing peace every single day until he died in 2009 at age 83. The Lancaster in the museum still stands today, a memorial to the 5,698 Canadian airmen who died, to the tens of thousands who survived but carried scars, to the tactical brilliance that changed how wars are fought, to the moral complexity that changed how wars are understood. If you visit that museum, there's a plaque now, added in 2010. It quotes something David Cole said in his last interview before he died. We flew into darkness because our nations asked us to. We destroyed an evil, but we also destroyed parts of ourselves. History will debate if we were heroes or war criminals. I believe we were neither. We were young men doing an impossible job in impossible times. Remember us not for the bombs we dropped, but for the peace we chose afterward. The Black Stream flew into history and changed the world, not just through the bombs it dropped or the factories it destroyed or the war it shortened, but through the lesson it taught about courage and doubt about victory and guilt about enemies and brothers. Sometimes the most dangerous weapon is not the newest technology or the biggest bomb. Sometimes it's just determination, discipline, trust, the willingness to do terrible things for necessary reasons, and then carry the weight of those things for the rest of your life. The Canadians proved that. Jimmy learned it. Klaus survived it. David lived it. And now you know it too. The story that was buried. The truth that was forgotten. The men who flew into darkness and changed how we fight wars and make peace. Remember them, honor them, learn from them. Not just the tactical lessons about concentration of force and overwhelming firepower, but the moral lessons about duty and doubt, about victory and guilt, about doing your best with impossible choices and then choosing forgiveness afterward. That's the real legacy of the Black Stream. That's the story that matters. That's the truth that endures. They were just farm boys from Saskatchewan and Manitoba. Just quiet men who did a job that needed doing. Just soldiers who became warriors, who became peacemakers. Just heroes who never wanted to be called heroes, but earned the title anyway through courage and sacrifice, and the wisdom to know that winning the war was only half the battle. The other half was winning the peace, in their own hearts, with their former enemies, with themselves, and in the end that victory might have been the hardest one of all.